Two, one. What is up, everybody? Welcome to the Park Score podcast. And today I am here with Mr. George Boreas once again. And we got a super special episode ready for you guys today. Today we're going to be talking about pagan gods and the origin of pagan gods and the origin of pagan religions. And so at this point, I feel like the audience is pretty familiar with George. We all know he's a Girard scholar. He is on Boreas Substack. He is author of Modern Malaise. George, what's up? How you been, man?
I'm good. Glad to be back for part two of our previous discussion.
Solid. Yeah, and so I was really thinking about you earlier today. So I was flipping through my copy of City of God. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, this was written by St. Augustine. Big fat book, about 1,000 pages, a little bit over that. And I got into this book whenever I was trying to learn more about Christian theology. And obviously, with this book being as kind of big as it is, and at points kind of dry, there's a lot in it that tends to get skipped over. But there's one piece of it in particular which has always sort of bewildered me, perplexed me. And I think that with George's background, I think he could offer some elucidation on it. Because in today's episode, we are going to be talking about the origin of pagan gods, where they come from. And I think that for someone who is reading this passage from City of God, and I can just get straight into it right here, the origin of pagan gods is not as obvious as it might seem, right? So a lot of us believe that pagan religions probably developed along the same lines as most other religions, like most, like maybe developed along the same lines of Christianity. Perhaps these other cultures had their own forms of revelation from their given deities, but that's not quite the picture that St. Augustine paints in City of God. And in fact, in City of God, St. Augustine he's grappling with sort of the collapse of his home country. A lot of people are pointing to Rome's adoption of Christianity as the reason for its collapse. And they're saying, well, because we have stopped worshiping the pagan gods, then they're cursing us. They're letting our civilization fail. It's because we're adopting Christianity that our civilization is coming apart. And the City of God book is essentially just Augustine's polemic against this form of thought. And he is essentially saying, no, these pagan gods, they did nothing to help humanity. They're also not responsible for where things are headed. The adoption of Christianity is not the reason why Rome is falling. But anyways, throughout all of this, he's answering a lot of critics, and he goes pretty hard at the pagan gods of the day. And there's one section in, I believe it's Book 8, Chapter 26, where he says pagan religion was bound up with the cult of the dead. And so if you guys don't mind, I'm going to read like a very short excerpt from that. And then George, if you can kind of like give us some background on this, because this is a very kind of confusing passage if you don't have some sort of background in, say, like a Rene Girard or like that sort of thing. So pagan religion was bound up with the cult of the dead. We should pay particular attention to what this Egyptian says in the course of his lament over the coming time when those institutions will be abolished in Egypt, which, on his own admission, were the work of men grievously astray and faithless, and estranged from true religious worship. His words are, "At that time, this land, the holy abode of shrines and temples, will be full of tombs and of dead men." This suggests that if these rites were not abolished, men would not be destined to die, or else that the dead were going to be put somewhere else than in the earth. Of course, as time goes on, the number of tombs increases because of the greater number of the dead. It seems, and he's previously in this passage, he was referencing Hermes Trismegistus, and he says that what Hermes was really lamenting was that the pagan temples and shrines would be succeeded by the memorials of our Christian martyrs. To be sure, those who read these words in a perverse spirit of hostility to Christianity suppose that the pagans used to worship gods in their temples, while we worship dead men in their tombs. Men are so blind in their impiety that, as it were, they bump into mountains and refuse to see what hits them in the eye. And so they fail to observe that in the whole of pagan literature, no gods, or scarcely any gods, are to be found who were not originally human beings, who had been accorded divine honors after their death. I pass over the statement of Varro, Varro was a poet of the time, that all the dead were regarded by the pagans as the gods called manes. Varro proves this by the rites which are performed for almost all the dead, mentioning especially the funeral games as being the most impressive proof of divinity, since the custom is to hold games only in honor of divine powers. Now, everything I've said so far has just kind of sort of been leading up to this point. Hermes himself, with whom we are at the moment concerned, testifies that the gods of Egypt are dead men. And then it goes on to say, there's a passage where he says, let's see. There's a part in here where he essentially says, let me see if I can find it. Well, first of all, George, what is your just immediate reaction to this?
Yeah, I mean, I see where this is setting, because I'm going to bring in the Girard perspective, right? Girard's anthropology, and the part about all gods being dead men sounds significant. I haven't read the City of God, at least not in its entirety. I did kind of dabble through it, and like you said, it's really big and dry at times. But yeah, I mean, I'm aware of it's a significant work, and it's significant because it's written at this transition between pagan times and Christianity. And maybe later we'll give some more examples of that. But it's a good segue into Girard's anthropology, right? And Girard's theory of how pagan gods originated. Girard didn't figure it out or didn't get the theory by reading the classics, including Augustine, although that kind of probably confirmed it for him. But he got it from modern anthropology, right? And by modern anthropology, I mean everything from 19th century, the Golden Bough, and all these modern European anthropologists who were visiting indigenous cultures and recording their customs and their rituals. And the big drive was to figure it out, right? To figure out the origin of culture, right? It was kind of just like in physics, you had scientists looking for a theory that explains electricity. You had anthropologists that were trying to explain the origin of religion. But they gave up. The original generation, like the first generation of them, gave up. They just thought it's too random, it's kind of violent, and then the idea popped up that it's kind of colonialist or racist, if you will, to try to figure everything out because each culture is different. But when Girard came at it, he cracked the code. You know, that's why we kind of celebrate him. So what is the code? The code is, again, I can start kind of from the beginning for those of you who are maybe not familiar or listening to this for the first time. You can ask yourself the question of what's common to all these ancient cultures or archaic cultures. And what's common is really not just that they have a religion, but that they pay a very close attention to sacrifice, bloody sacrifice. Okay, so Girard's theory is that early humans, if you think of some kind of pre-cultural hominid state, they had this unique problem of how to resolve their internecine strife and violence. So they're very intelligent animals suddenly. They're filled with these urges, right? Animal urges, acquisitive mimesis, and they can't. Open violence leads to mass death, right? With these animals or humans. So humans can't battle it out in some kind of non-lethal duels to establish alpha males and dominance hierarchies. So what humans essentially did is they would channel their violence outward. Okay, so if you imagine a community, I don't know, some kind of archaic community, individuals would be frustrated with each other. They would be maybe hesitant. You can't just openly attack each other. There would be this tension, this kind of slowly rising frustration. And what happens to resolve that tension and frustration would be the scapegoating mechanism. Of course, they weren't aware they're scapegoating, But what would happen is through mimesis, through imitation of blame, not just desire, but through imitation of blame, one person, one individual would be singled out as bearing responsibility for the chaos. Now, if you think about it, how can one individual cause all these problems? Well, maybe because they're somehow magical. They have magical powers. They are able to throw a curse on the community. And then a very early community would kind of create a mob, a lynch mob around this person. They would unite. So there'd be a big contrast between disunity that was causing strife and chaos and sudden union around this victim who would be eliminated. And then suddenly peace would return. So Girard writes somewhere how the peace was really unintended. So early on, it was very naive and unintended. So these people didn't know. They didn't think, oh, let's just kill this person and we're going to get peace. No, it was just kind of pure, raw channeling and of blame and so on. This person dies and suddenly and unexpectedly the community finds themselves at peace. So it's as though the dead victim brought the blessing. And because the dead victim brings the blessing, it seems as though they're alive, isn't it? And because the dead victim brought a blessing, even though people didn't plan it, it seems as though this victim had a higher will, both the will to bring the community into chaos and the will to bless the community through its death. So this murder is appreciated so much that the community feels the need to repeat it or reenact it every time there's a crisis. So this is where you get the birth of the sacrificial ritual. Early on, the lynching was kind of repeated every time there's a crisis. Later on, it might be like seasonal, become seasonal. You know, when there's a change of seasons or a king dies, that's sort of like a mini crisis. And you had this need to contain the chaos by killing the holy victim, or the sacred victim, I should say. So, and then there's myth. So accompanying the ritual, there would be a story told about that foundational event, right? Now, myth is not going to tell you the truth, right? The myth's not going to tell you what we consider the truth, which is that this is a scapegoat, arbitrary victim, surrogate victim. No, of course there's going to be mythology of how this person is magical, how he or she brought the curse, how it blessed the community. There's going to be, myths really just means dissimulation, right? It just kind of means hiding the truth. It still means that in the modern language. But it really, that's what mythology is. It's a retelling of the foundational murder from the perspective of the killers, from the persecutors. And over many, many years of history, myths get dissimulated. So if the more primitive the myth, the more kind of raw and violent it is. As culture gets refined, there's a natural tendency towards hiding the raw, violent truth of it. So you get kind of more and more refined myths, and later you get myths that might not even involve a murder. But if you kind of compare all the myths like Girard did, you kind of see this, you can trace this lineage going to foundational murder. So that would be where these things meet, right? Going back to Augustine, why would you say that all the gods used to be dead humans? I mean, that would be a sacrilegious thing to say to a pagan, really, because what you're basically saying is that your God, whom you killed and who you delivered you, is just a human. Girard would argue, and I would argue that it takes the Christian and the biblical revelation to be able to say that. Because outside of that revelation, humans are not able to face up to the reality of, to the kind of raw, true reality of the foundational murder.
Yeah, and so you hit on a good point earlier, which I think is worth expounding on. So there's this idea sort of that what otherwise could be considered history becomes sort of victim of conspiracy, because obviously we know if the community or certain actors within the community are conspiring to have a scapegoated, then there has to be some sort of a cover up, right? Even when Christ was crucified, there was an attempt to make false accusations about him, and so this is sort of characteristic of all of these myths that we see forming, which is that they go from being histories to being sort of conspiracies to being myths. And so earlier, I was talking about how Augustine seems to have this same. There's no chance Augustine would have known anything about Girard, but in City of God, he seems to put it forth that this is sort of a secret teaching that's been passed on by the philosophers since early Egyptian times. Like they sort of had this understanding of the production of myth, and it was something that itself was a bit too raw of a truth. It was a bit too serious for people to become aware of, and so it was sort of passed down in secret. There's one passage that I think is even more pertinent than the one I had read previously, and he tells of this story of. So he says, genuine revelations about the meaning of those cults, meaning the cults which rise up around pagan gods, which Numa Pompilius took care to conceal by having them buried with him, which were turned up by a plow, and then were burnt by order of the Senate. So I might have, sort of punctuated that wrong while I was saying it, but essentially he talks about this person named Numa Pompilius, who was buried with records of the making of these myths. So I forget which myths they were in particular, but essentially there was this person who was just plowing the fields one day, and he happens to. It says here that essentially he was plowing the fields nearby a tomb, and a sort of record was unearthed of. It seemed like it was recounting the gods of that society, but almost in the form of a history. And it seemed to shed light on the fact that the gods worshipped by that society at large were in fact not gods, but were actually humans who, over the course of time, had been deified via myth. And so he says, Jupiter, Juno, Saturn, Vulcan, Vesta, and all those others, whom Varro tries to identify with the parts or elements of the universe. All these, according to this revelation, were originally human beings. Now, what's interesting, too, is that he said that these accounts were, it says, burnt by order of the Senate, meaning that at this point in time, when this sort of revelation came to light, that these gods worshipped by the society of the time were, in fact, human beings. It's sort of this thing that is... It's like too dangerous. Like the public cannot know about this, because if you think about it, at this point in time, the scapegoat mechanism is itself still, I think, probably unconsciously felt by humanity as something that is like order producing, right? But they don't realize that also it's what leads to the continuation of violence. Because the thing about the scapegoat mechanism is the violence is hidden, is buried, and the murder victim is the foundation of the new social order. But also, like in the case with Cain, so the victim, the city is built on the cadaver of the victim, but a society built on violence, as Girard says, can only continue and beget more violence. And what's funny about this whole sort of conspiratorial view of the start of the Roman religion is that this is what most people assume Christianity is, right? This is what most people assume Christianity is. Most people assume that the apostles were part of this like group conspiracy to sort of paint Jesus as this God figure, and that Christianity is just this big conspiracy, when in reality, it's Christianity itself which sort of exposes this mechanism of myth generation, like at large. It sort of blows the doors open, and Christianity is like the whistleblower for this whole scapegoat sort of mechanism.
Yeah.
But so I'd like to honestly ask you, George, or go ahead with whatever point you were going to ask, because I have something I'd like to ask afterward. Okay.
Let's hear the question.
Yeah. So
I'll, incorporate it.
okay, solid. So for you, so obviously, if you were met with someone who was maybe trying to pick this apart, and they were to say, well, I mean, how can you know, if you're admitting that all of these other religions are just attempts by human beings to deify what were in all reality just other human beings, how then do you know that Christianity is not also just more of the same? And they might even grant that Christianity exposes this this mechanism in previous human cultures and in pagan cultures.
Yeah, very good. We're getting at the heart of it, I think. These questions are addressed, so I'm going to try to do it justice. Early on, you mentioned the word conspiracy, and that's a touchy subject. And I think that modern conspiracies are very much related in spirit to paganism in some way. What you're saying, so from what I hear, there's these people, what you're saying, there's these people that are suddenly aware of the ugly truth of pagan religions, which is that they're based on basically, foundational murder, mob lynching, and there's an attempt to destroy that. The big question, and I think this is a very important nuanced point a lot of people missed, is if you go back to the original paganism, people very, very much love to distinguish between the people and the elites, okay? And I think a lot of people might think of the system and say something like, okay, so there's this elite priestly class that's kind of knows what's going on, knows what's up, and they're kind of selling this story to the masses to pacify them, but the priests, the inner chamber secret society, knows it's all a big lie. This is not what Girard thinks. But I think it's a very important point that needs to be debated, okay? Because it's not easy, at least to me, to deny it. To Girard, the essential thing that would make paganism work is the unconsciousness, the unawareness of the truth by everyone, the unanimity of it, all right? Because the moment you realize that you're killing an innocent victim is the moment that thing stops working. So true pagans, like true archaic religions, neither the priests nor the people, according to Girard's theory, would be aware of the big lie. So everybody would be in on it, and that's what would allow for the catharsis, for the cleansing of violence and introduction of peace. So you can think of it as basically a grassroots movement. The true paganism is a mob phenomenon. So this is how I'd argue. So is it the elites giving it, kind of guiding it, or is it the mob? I don't think it was the elites. Why? For the simple reason that the elites did not exist originally. Okay? The mythology is what created the elites, not the other way around. Okay? So people think like, okay, there are these elites in ancient times and they created a false religion. No. There was no elites in original times. In original times, we were in an animal state. There was no pomp and circumstance. There was no priestly class. There was no kings. It was a bunch of egalitarian savages, who were a mob, who are a very violent mob, and the only way they could get along was through the sacrificial victim. But it's not because they sat down. Okay, so again, this is a very nuanced point. It's not because the mob sat down and said, look, guys, we can't really get along. Why don't we just kill a random person? We'll be happy. psychologically that doesn't work. The moment you realize that, the whole thing falls apart. No, this mob truly hates each other. They truly believe they're possessed by spirits. And they eventually end up truly believing that that random person, the hunchback, right? The limper, is throwing a curse on them. They unite together in an act of very powerful solidarity. They eliminate that person, and they feel like that person is a spirit. Over many, many iterations of that, you get the priestly class. Okay, so once this mob starts doing the ritual, that's when you get the designated victim. That's when you get sort of like a special status person. That's when you get priests administering it. And maybe later on in high levels of civilization, you might start getting priests or priestly class who are starting to wake up to the truth. But really, according to Girard, the human species was too fallen to see the truth. It was too violent. Okay? It was the Bible and the biblical revelation culminated in Jesus Christ who made that truth plain. So if you're telling me that the Egyptian priests knew that their religion was BS, you're essentially, I mean, to Girard at least, that boils down to me telling me that Christ's revelation was not necessary, right? Because if the Egyptian priests already knew the truth of their messed up system, why do you need Christ? I mean, some humans knew it. So what? Some humans don't need that revelation, but some do. And this is where we get into the theological waters. You know, like who's the ultimate conspiracy theorist or conspiracist rather? It's Satan, right? The demons. We can talk about that. The devil. It's the devil's mechanism. Does he know the truth and deny it? Maybe. I don't know. That's a theology question. Did he make his like satanic mechanism consciously obvious to some priestly class? I don't know. But overall, the key argument of Girard is that humans must be unconscious of the victory mechanism in order to for it to work. And then maybe in Augustine's times, when these pagans start burning their records, you know what the idea I go to is that it's a reaction to Christianity. Because Christianity is spreading, because the cross, the Jesus Christ on the cross is kind of like shining this light on the ugliness of pagan religion, pagans are starting to realize that too, and they're starting to bury their truth. Just like today, we're always trying to bury like the truth that we're victimizing someone, right? But in those early days, that was kind of very innocent and a big reaction. So if the Romans were burning the records and Greeks were burning the records, to me that sounds like a reaction to Christianity, because now everybody's aware, hey, that whole thing was just brutal, stupid violence. So these guys trying to say, no, it wasn't that. You know, our gods are noble and so on. And that was already happening in classical Greece. There was always the simulation, right? You look at ancient myths. You know, Dionysus gets torn apart. You know, what's up with that? Like, just torn apart. Or, you know, every god is a criminal. You know, Zeus is a rapist, stuff like that. You know, every god's a criminal. A lot of them get killed. But then at the same time, you're supposed to think like, no, Dionysus is the god of wine. Zeus is the chief god. So even in classical times, there's this kind of distancing for violence. But once the full revelation of Christianity comes around, there's definitely a need to hide. And we talked about the drugs too, you know, and all kinds of stuff. I mean, today, in the full light of modernity, you can't have any single religion anymore kind of just openly do blood sacrifice. I mean, it's an outrageous. But in those times, it wasn't. A lot of cultures were openly sacrificing humans, and nobody really had an argument against it. It's kind of weird. But Carthaginians sacrifice humans. Romans hated it, but it's like they never said like, "Whoa, that's bad." It's kind of odd. But anyways, that's going off on another topic, but I'm going to stop there with that. Actually, I forgot your last question. Did I even answer that last question?
I have something to kind of... So you kind of talked about how it's sort of... Go ahead.
No, I was just... what was that last question? Did I answer it? That's all I have to say.
I think so.
Just follow up with anything else.
Yeah. So my main question was essentially, you know, obviously with a sort of Girardian awareness of the conspiratorial nature of these founding myths. Girard seems to say that Christianity is something altogether different, right? But someone who might be a bit more critical of Christianity, they might counter and say, well, how do you know that Christianity is not just another one of these myths? And you seem to say, if I kind of understand you correctly, it's that Christianity is producing a real consciousness around the nature of this mechanism. At least that it seemed like that was one of your points to Christianity's credit, and one of the things that sort of differentiates Christianity. Now, you did speak about something where you said how essentially you're a bit dubious of the claim that this priestly class knew about this founding myth and just decided it was worth going forward with anyway, because obviously if they know about this mechanism, this scapegoat mechanism, and how it produces these religions that deify human beings or deify them in myth, that if they were truly aware, then they would not sort of be complicit in this. But I want to honestly push back on that a little bit and kind of offer you my theory on why they might have been complicit in it, even despite being aware of it. And let me know what you think about this. So in Plato's Republic, he talks about the noble lie, right? And what is the noble lie? The noble lie is essentially that the philosophers, they know what the good is, they know what truth is, they know what beauty is, but it's just something that can't quite be communicated to the unwashed masses, right? They'll never get it. These people will never get it. And so we have to come up with the noble lie. And the noble lie is essentially this way of organizing society where we withhold like the ultimate truth from people in order to sort of maintain order. And Plato was obviously a philosopher. And I think in this case, I think that it's not necessarily the priests in the case of Hermes Trismegistus that were the ones who were aware, right? I think it's more so the philosophers. And if you really think about it, you could say that, well, first of all, there's the noble lie thing. Like they rationalize in their mind that withholding the truth about this mechanism is in a way a means toward a greater good. And I think this also points to the fact that really we talk about the mob being the one who's responsible for scapegoating. But if you think about it, the elites are in some way most susceptible to this scapegoating impulse within human nature, because their power is derived from social status. Their power is derived from maintaining like whatever semblance of power they have in the existing order. So if there's chaos in society and I can tell that my power is like incumbent upon the status quo being maintained, I might lead the charge to try to make sure that this scapegoating goes in the way that I would like it. And so elites are most susceptible because their power is derived from social status, and it has to be consolidated via conspiracy and scapegoating. Like, for example, the Pharisees, right? The Pharisees were the ones who had the deepest, the most familiarity with the Torah, but they were perfectly willing to kind of bend its meaning, bend the intent of Scripture to try to fit their agenda. And then also too, I think this could springboard us into a conversation about Apollonius of Tyana. So, George, you know Apollonius of Tyana. For those in the audience, Apollonius of Tyana, he was a philosopher and also sort of like a magician of the early, first, second century. And people, a lot of times, atheists especially, will say Apollonius of Tyana, if you look at his teachings and you look at the life of Apollonius of Tyana, he is essentially like a mirror image of the character of Jesus, right? So he goes from city to city preaching this philosophy of love. He's trying to teach people the higher way. Apollonius is obviously a reference to the sun god. Matter of fact, he was known as quote unquote the son of God. That was one of the things that he was referred to as. He had a miraculous birth according to certain historians, and his teaching was all about love and about pursuing wisdom and all this sort of thing. Now, Apollonius of Tyana, you could say, was sort of one of the elites. He was certainly well educated. Now, Girard seems to counter this polemic used by atheists, and say that no, actually, Apollonius of Tyana was not necessarily. He can't exactly be equivocated to Christ. And I don't know if you kind of want to like expand on that a little bit, or kind of talk to us a little bit about Apollonius of Tyana.
Yeah. Right. There's Girard has a chapter, the horrible miracle of Apollonius of Tyana. I'm trying to look up who wrote that book, but it was written about 200 years after he lived. And the miracle really explains, puts in contrast that difference between mob gods and Christianity, which is kind of an anti-mob religion. And it really ties in with the question that I guess still haven't answered, which is, how is Christianity anti-mob? So the horrible miracle of Apollonius of Tyana, again, it's in a book written by his biographer about 200 years later. The book is written at the time when, similar time as Augustine, really, at the time when Christianity was waning, paganism was waning, and Christianity was on the rise. And this biographer, Apollonius, was trying to kind of rescue the popularity of paganism and say, look, Christians think they have miracle workers and itinerant preachers, so do we. So as a sort of a bragging thing, he recounts the miracle that Apollonius brought about in the city of Ephesus, which is Turkey. At the time, it was one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the Roman Empire. So the story tells how there was a plague in Ephesus, and the people were desperate for a cure. So they invite Apollonius to cure it. Now, one thing to note that Girard notes is that the word plague kind of means, like an epidemic of disorder. We today think of a biological plague. Could be, right? But even if it's a biological plague, it would be accompanied by social disorder, right? So when you read the word plague in ancient writings, you got to read beyond just the biological plague. You got to read, a plague of disorder, a social collapse, right? So as Apollonius, this is from the book, as Apollonius, very significantly, as Apollonius is getting on a ship to cure this plague, he notes to his companion observing sailors on a ship that they're boarding, I suppose, saying, look how these sailors get along really well, right? Everybody's trying to outdo one another in their particular task. So as long as they each focus on doing their own task, the ship is going to sail. But if they start contending with each other, if they neglect their work, the ship's going to sink. So anyways, they go to Ephesus. They meet in the public forum, whatever, with the locals. They're expecting Apollonius to solve the plague. And Apollonius points to a homeless person, a vagrant, who appears blind. You can imagine he's very poor. He's begging for bread. And he points at him and he says to the people, this man is a demon. He's the reason why it's caused a plague. You have to stone him. And as a first reaction, the Ephesians are shocked. How could this person who looks so harmless, so powerless, how could he be the one? And everybody's hesitant to buy in. But Apollonius keeps repeating that. And by the way, this is a story narrated by a fan of Apollonius. So this is not some kind of debunking by Christian apologists. This is his own fans, right, or his own fan base explaining the story.
Right.
So at first they're hesitant to throw the first stone, but on the consistent urging of Apollonius, somebody throws the first stone. Once that first stone is thrown, There's a rain of stones being thrown. The man's eyes are set to light up in a really strange way, and this serves as a proof of demonic possession. Girard interprets that as just indignation. No, as that maybe just shock. I kind of interpret it as this man kind of becoming aware of the truth of, pagan lies. But anyways, the flying of stones, it's mimetic, right? The flying of stones, this rage you see among your friends and peers, it sucks you in. It's irresistible, right? So that's mimetic theory, right? Like once everybody's venting their outrage at this one person, everybody's suddenly convinced that this is a demon cursing us, you are compelled to do so too. There's a positive feedback loop, and people enter such a rage that there's a pile of stones on top of his body by the end of it, a cairn of stones. Girard later argues that this is the origin of tombs. I don't know about that, maybe. But eventually they undig the stones, and in the place of the cadaver of the homeless man, they see a cadaver of a giant dog. Everybody sees it, right? Again, in his naturalistic way, Girard argues that everybody's basically hypnotized with their basically rage and their, you can imagine that this cadaver was so disfigured, it was kind of easy for somebody to say, hey, look, it's a dog, it's a giant monster, right? And everybody agrees with it. And the story concludes how the plague was cured. Again, I mean, if you're thinking of it as a biological plague, you might think like, how can this cure bacterial infection or viral infection? But if you think of a plague as a just social disorder, now that everybody's agreed that this person is the reason everybody hates each other, they stop hating each other. Now they're all friends. They all got rid of the demon. They're the good guys. Everybody's a good guy now. They can go back to being that harmonious society where everybody minds their own business. And then later, in the place where this person was stoned, they erect the statue of Hercules, right? God Hercules, and they create a cult around that. So, as a few important notes here, okay? First of all, it's as though this story, the way the story is told, it's told in a way that it's half myth but half realistic. You have this mythology, Hercules saving the city, demons, and so on. But on the other hand, you have a really kind of realistic detail of a stoning. So Girard would argue that if this happened 1,000 years earlier in the heart of pagan times, the realistic part would have been skipped. All you would have gotten was some myth about a monster invading the city and Hercules maybe slaying them. You know what I mean? But because of Christianity, the realism has crept in. We also see the essential mob reality of pagan religion. Again, there's no priestly class here. So to address your point about, first of all, kind of going backwards here, about your point about conspiratorial elites. I'm not saying, they can certainly be conspiratorial elites. They certainly are conspiratorial elites, right? I mean, it's called corruption, right? And corruption happens in every society. You can have an elite, priestly elite, that's watching its cult, its sacred victims become desacralized, and then they just feed the need out of self-interested reasons. They feel the need to feed more victims to maintain order. My main argument, Girard's really main argument against, it really has to do with origins, okay? And the only thing I can say about that really is that there is no elite without the sacrificial victim, okay? So according to Girard, you didn't have class systems or elites or culture before you had the sacrificial victim. So the first sacrificial victim could not have possibly been fed to the people by the elite. There was no elite. There was no culture, right? So the sacrificial system created gods and deities that later enabled the priestly class to officiate that. And then, of course, later on, when you have high-end culture, you can have corrupt elites. And about the Bible, I was just reading about that. There's a whole book Girard writes about how exactly does the Bible contradict all this stuff. Girard likes the story of Joseph, and he really likes to think of Joseph as the reverse of Oedipus, right? So in mythology, the victim is already always guilty, and always a god. There's not a lot of moralizing, right? If you look at maybe some native Indian myths, right? The god Loki, or Scandinavian god Loki, comes to the banquet. He steals the sacred fruit. He gets chased off a cliff or flies in the sky, and that blesses the community. Not a lot of moralizing there. It's just God is a thief, but also his theft blesses the community. With Greek tragedy, there's a partial revelation of the truth, right? Because the Greeks are starting to see, and we can get deep into this. I'm not gonna. But with Greek tragedies, the tragic hero, the Oedipus, the Gerard, Oedipus is just an evolved version of the sacred victim, right? Oedipus committed incest and patricide. There's a plague in his city. Once people figure out that he committed incest and parricide, he gouges his eyes out. He admits he's guilty, gouges his eyes out, and he becomes both a victim and a sacred person, bringing a blessing to Thebes. But in Greek mythology, it doesn't go all the way to the Bible saying like, hey, this guy's innocent. It just kind of leaves it there. It says this is messed up. This is the tragedy of human experience, right? That's how the moderns interpret it. But there's not a lot of moralizing. If you look at the Bible consistently, first of all, insists that the victim is innocent, and secondly, insists that the storyline around the victim, it kind of deflates it. It sucks the air out of it. It sucks the self-righteousness out of it. The ancient Hebrews were really not into sacred victims at all. They had none. Very early on, you mentioned Cain already. Abel, maybe in another culture, he would have been a sacred victim whose murder founded cities, just like Romulus and Remus, right? But in the Bible, yes, Cain did found cities, right? He did start culture, but he's a killer, okay? The blood of his brother cries out of the earth. Then you go on, another one to mention briefly is Joseph, okay? Very big. It's kind of like this fractal reverse iteration of myth. First of all, his brothers gang up on him. And the Bible is not saying he's innocent even. The Bible is saying maybe he deserved it. But he's definitely not like a sacred victim. His brothers were jealous, but he was a bragger. They throw him in the well. He's innocent though. He goes to Egypt. In Egypt, he also becomes kind of like a failed Oedipus, because in Egypt, Potiphar's wife, right, one of his, he gets basically adapted as a slave in this high official's household, and the guy's wife accuses him of trying to rape her, which is kind of similar to Oedipus if you think about it. He's technically trying to commit incest because he's an adopted son, but again, the Bible insists he's innocent, right? Then again, at the end of that story, there's this reversal where Joseph asks your brothers come back to him. Now he's like the chief vizier, and Joseph reverses the scapegoating mechanism. He says, "I'll give you rice, or sorry, not rice. I spent too much time in Asia. I'll give you wheat, but you gotta leave. You gotta leave one of your brothers." Or he sets up Benjamin, right? And he says, "Oh, Benjamin stole, so I'll let you go, but you gotta leave Benjamin." And Benjamin is the only remaining son of Jacob with Rachel, whatever. Anyway, so he forces his brothers to sacrifice one of their brothers to get the wheat, the grain, and then Judah, right, the ancestor of Christ, offers himself instead of his brother Benjamin, because he knows his dad will be really sad if Benjamin doesn't come back. And then Joseph forgives them because of Judah's sacrifice. So this is an extreme. This is not just kind of stumbling against one victim. This can happen in any culture. Somebody's going to say, "Oh, this victim is innocent." It's a very elaborate, very deeply spiritual debunking at a very high level of mythology. Okay, Job is another thing. Job, sorry, the whole book written in Job by Gerard, saying how basically maybe in the original version Job was just a failed sacrificial victim. His friends come to him and say, "Look, you deserve death. You should be blamed." And Job says, "No, God is not like that," and so on. And of course, then there's Christ. After the crucifixion, when Christ gets crucified, there is it's in the pagan event. Okay, it's basically a pagan event, and what's very significant is that the Jews and the priestly class of the Jews join into the pagan event. Okay, I'll read you a very banger quote that I just stumbled out by Gerard. Okay, he said in an interview, "The resurrected Christ appears only to the people who ultimately have succeeded from the mob. The resurrected God of the myth appears to the mob. He is the God of the mob. Vox populi, vox Dei. He is the voice of the mob." Okay, so yeah, I'm just checking connection. We're good. So the mob greets Jesus as God at the beginning. You know, Hosanna, right? And when he enters Jerusalem in a donkey, the mob is against him. When he's getting crucified, the mob wants him. When he's on trial, the mob wants him crucified. So, is it a different mob? I think a lot of Christians think it's a different mob. His fans greeted him, but his enemies didn't. But his enemies want him hanged. Not to Gerard. Okay, to Gerard, it's the same mob. The same people who greeted him as a king are the people who want him crucified now. And it's not just the people; it's his disciples too. His disciples the whole time, 12 apostles, right? They thought he was divine. When he's on trial and he's getting crucified, where are they? They're gone. They disappeared. They were sucked into the mob. They were sucked into the pagan epiphany, right? The pagan event, the pagan version of deity. And when the chief priest, the Gerard, when the chief priest says, you know, it's better than one man die so that the nation can live. That's how he justifies that of Jesus. Yeah. Again, I think to a lot of people, it's, you know, they're thinking this guy's just being an asshole, basically, right? He knows Jesus is innocent. But it's not to Gerard, right? This guy really believes it. He really believes it. He's right. Acting out of genuine concern. He's like, my job is to save the people of Israel. We need to sacrifice this person so that our nation can live, right? So the chief priests, the Romans, everybody joins the mob, and the death of Christ does bring peace to the mob in the pagan way. It brings peace because the Romans and the Jews reconcile, right? Herod and Pilate become best of friends. Even Peter, right, the main apostle, abandons Christ 3 times or denies him. Gerard has a very famous interpretation of the scene where Peter is trying to warm himself at the fire. So Peter joins the mob that persecutes Christ, and he's warming himself at the fire. When they accuse him of being one of them, he denies it. He denounces Christ. That means he just doesn't just say no. He actually is forced to kind of like, you know, we don't know what words he says, but to, in strong terms, in clear terms, say, no, Christ deserves to die. So it's a serious denouncement by Peter. So basically, Christ's life ends up in this pagan lynching, and it could have produced a pagan God, but it didn't, because Christ does not appear, like, so the real Christ, the resurrected Christ, Gerard writes about it, does not appear to the mob. Some other deity appears to the mob, like the violent God who doesn't tolerate these, offenses. But God doesn't appear to the mob because he's not God of the mob. He's the God of the exception. So he appears to a minority, and even a minority that betrayed him. And then the whole Christianity is just a giant debunking of this, pagan mindset. So there's a lot more to it. I mean, the entire kind of Bible is suffused with this spirit. Why do they persecute me? Psalms, David, right? It's all about getting, obviously, like a very strong opposition to paganism and to polytheism among Hebrews and later Christians. It all has to do that. To Gerard, he's not saying that's the whole truth of religion, but like you can really interpret it really well in those terms, right? It's basically this huge historical term where we're no longer have religions based on sacrificial blood. Christ is the last one. He's the final perfect victim. Now we're going to not do that anymore.
So I have a question for you, because as we were preparing for this podcast, this kind of hit me, and I haven't necessarily been able to square it away. So obviously we've been talking about how the sacrificial victims of these pagan religions are oftentimes sort of deified in some sense. Maybe they're, and also we know that pagan gods a lot of times were depicted as kind of despicable. Like St. Augustine talks about how in City of God, he talks about how the Roman people would reenact the myths of the gods in their plays, and it would be these awful acts, like you were saying, things that are not even fit for humans to do necessarily, much less beings that are supposedly gods, like you said, Zeus, graping left and right, fratricide, incest, all of these things. So, so if we know that the scapegoat mechanism produces deified victims, my question is, so we know that in the ancient world, the idea of a resurrected, a god being resurrected, that was not controversial. Like nowadays, people hear about the crucifixion, they go, "Oh, how could a man resurrect from the dead? How could That wasn't the controversy back in the ancient world. The controversy in the ancient world, people would be like, "Okay, fine, he resurrected, but why would a god allow himself to be crucified?" So my question is, if you could help me kind of understand, or if you have like any ideas on the congruence here. So why would it be controversial that Christ would be crucified if, pagan gods were themselves sort of seen as gods, but also, seemingly human beings who were themselves scapegoated? Do you see, like, I'm trying to like square that away.
Yeah. Right. Okay, so let me try here. Again, we're getting to the heart of the issue here. You're right, and I mean, this is Dionysus and all these kinds of deities. There's a very common archaic and pagan idea of the cycle of death and rebirth, right? God gets torn apart, and he rises back up. And again, all right. So, why is Jesus's resurrection different, right? Or why is his crucifixion so different? Because the previous resurrections they're the simulations, not purposeful. They're subconscious dissimulations of mob violence. So, how does Dionysus, maybe not Dionysus, but let's just say Dionysus, right? The god who gets torn apart, right? The idea is from Sophocles, it's Euripides, from the play, for the Oedipus King play, right? People neglect the cult of Dionysus. Dionysus sends a plague. People are dying left and right, being torn apart. The king who kind of caused it, who ordered the neglection of the cult, he doesn't know how to deal with it. Then god Dionysus shows up in the city. He causes the king to be torn to pieces, and orders reestablished. And I think there's another myth with Dionysus where like the Titans tear him apart as a child. I don't know. The essential difference would be who gets the blame and who's violent. Okay, so with pagans, gods are violent. Like if you disrespect gods, they're gonna throw a plague at you. They're gonna require blood or even if you don't, disrespect them, every once in a while, they're violent, they're dangerous, they're more powerful than you. But here's the good news. If you feed them some blood, if you defer to them, if you propitiate them with blood, they will leave you alone. All right. So gods are violent, they're dangerous, they require victimhood. And once they receive that victimhood, they're happy again. And sometimes the victim is the god. I guess that's maybe the nuanced part, because the god can never die. So even if you tear him apart, he just gets reincarnated. And maybe to a lot of Hebrews, to a lot of Jews, the Christ story did sound pagan, and that's why they rejected it. But the radical difference. So Saint Paul has this, and a lot of theologians, early church fathers have this. They say that Christ reenacted the pagan myth in order to draw in the pagans, right? Mm-hmm. So something like Christ dupes Satan. First of all, he uses Satan's mechanism to expose Satan. What that means, it's again very fractal. Among other things, let's put it this way, that maybe all these pagans, Romans and all these other nations, wouldn't be interested in the Christ story unless it strongly reminded them of their own religion, right? Mm-hmm. But once they receive it, the violence becomes debunked. Why? Because unlike sacred victims, Christ, it's insisted that he's innocent, right? It's insisted that he's not wrathful. His entire example is the example of not blaming other people, right? Of not finding surrogate victims, right? What else? Even the way he's resurrected. A lot of Gnostics and these people that kind of try to appropriate Christianity would say something that, maybe even Muslims, they say, Christ wasn't a real person, he was just a ghost. So like when they crucified him, he kind of just disappeared, or Muslims think he was kind of just spirited away or something, because people can't accept that. Even pagans who can accept God being torn apart, they can't accept that being like true death and true loss, right? It's kind of like a trick, because God he's a spirit, he doesn't really have a body, he can easily dispose of bodies, right? But Christianity insists that it was a real death, that it was a real body, that when Christ was resurrected, he didn't come back as a ghost, as maybe a pagan god would, right, or some avatar, but he came back in the flesh. And the whole thing is a big exposure of the big, what's it called, like debunking, the big expose on this whole system, right? Christianity turns everything on its head, and both the Jewish Hebrew authorities and the Roman authorities and the mob and even the apostles, they are exposed as guilty, right? Well, guilty or just fallen, right? Whereas the victim is revealed. And once that's why early Christians really emphasize the cross. Right now, cross is being de-emphasized. But I remember as a kid, in Orthodoxy, like the priests would just kind of talk about the cross, the Holy Cross. Catholics talk about the Holy Cross. So I think these early Christians and pagans, cross was a huge symbol. It was, like you can imagine to Romans, it was like kind of the nastiest thing you can think of. The last thing you want to see in your house is a cross. That's a curse. That's where the criminals go. But once you put that cross front and centered, what you're basically telling people is your persecuting ways, right? Your way of blaming things on magical victims, your gods that demand blood, that's an ugly truth, right? So here the cross exposes the ugly truth and kind of awakens us to our own ugliness, really, and drives the civilization away from sacred victims. So I'll stop there.
Yeah. No, yeah, that's good. And so one thing, so earlier whenever we were talking about Apollonius of Tyana, so in a lot of these myths, in the myth of Oedipus and in this story about Apollonius of Tyana, the plague is something that is recurring, like this concept of the plague. Now, one thing that I think is really important to mention, because obviously the plague seems to be sort of a central theme in a lot of these foundational myths when it comes to these pagan religions and these pagan gods and all that. One thing that's sort of taken for granted is the fact that this is long before any concept of germ theory. Girard kind of talks about this at length, but he essentially says that, at this point in time, a plague is not something that is obviously some sort of widespread, infection, or disease or virus or something like that. A plague in this sense, there's no clear way for ancient peoples to delineate between what is a virus, what is due to germs, and what is simply like a social malaise, or like a social contagion, or some sort of, Girard talks about the mimetic crises. And so one thing here that I also wanted to point out with regard to Apollonius of Tyana is that one of the refutations I've heard with regard to Apollonius is that whereas atheists and people who are trying to discredit Christ by pointing to Apollonius say that he was a healer and he worked miracles, if you go and you read his the life of Apollonius of Tyana, his miracles, his miracle healings, it's rarely anything other than him offering some sort of herbal solution. Like a lot of times, like if you go and look at the stories, I forget what the specific story is, but always he'll prescribe something that is not. It's more akin to like a wise man. But if you try to dilute these stories and you are seeking to sort of discredit Christianity, then you'll kind of take the shortcut of trying to conflate those things. One thing that was super interesting as I was researching Apollonius of Tyana, I was going through his quotes. And a lot of his quotes talk about, how the love of wisdom is like the ultimate virtue, how it's funny, a lot of them read kind of like modern day like self-improvement, like generic like self-improvement quotes. No doubt he was, for that time, it had to have been something fairly developed, sort of ahead of its time. But one quote that really stood out to me as showing the clear delineation between, say, an Apollonius of Tyana and Jesus Christ is, he has a quote, I'm paraphrasing it here, so, take it with a grain of salt. But essentially the quote says something to the effect of, the good man is one who loves his friends and hates his enemies, right? Because you think to the pagan mind or to the pre-Christian mind, the concept of loving one's enemies or having compassion for one's enemies, it's absurd. It's unheard of. Behind me in my bookshelf, I have this book. It's called Christ the Eternal Tao. And it's a look at the Tao as a sort of like flowering of man's natural, like it's like the closest that natural man could get to a concept of the Logos. And in that book, it talks about how Lao Tzu, who was the teacher of the Tao, there's a funny story in there where he's speaking to Confucius, and he tells Confucius essentially that like the perfect man is the one who loves his enemies. And it says that Confucius was like, this put like a bad taste in his mouth and made him not like he respected Lao Tzu, but he could not get behind this quote unquote perverse doctrine of loving one's enemies. And Confucius, as we know, he's the founder of Confucianism. Confucianism is very much like a lot of these pagan religions in that a main focus is like reverence of one's ancestors. A lot of pagan religions tend to be some form or repackaging of ancestor worship. And obviously Confucius taught some good values and was useful. But this bewildered him, this concept from Lao Tzu of loving one's enemies. And again, with Apollonius, we see here that the pinnacle of human wisdom is essentially to love one's friends and hate one's enemies. Like that is kind of the highest that you can get with purely human reason. And I think this essential distinction is also the distinction that we see between a religion that is essentially man-made, which is a pagan religion founded on scapegoat violence, versus religion that is revealed, which is God condescending to man and sort of like guiding him toward truth and rescuing him from darkness. And so, yeah, essentially, love of one's enemies or the refusal to scapegoat is completely confounding to sort of the pinnacle of purely natural human reason. But real quick, I know we're kind of getting kind of later on into the podcast, so I have a question for you, George, which is essentially that, on a future episode, we're hoping to talk about psychedelic entities, how they relate to this concept of otherworldly entities or pagan gods, or you could even say demons. For you, everything that we've said so far has essentially attributed pagan gods to a sort of man-made construction. Like pagan gods are, in essence, just humans who have been whose lives and whose histories have been obscured by myth and by the scapegoating mechanism. For you, is there any delineation between pagan gods that are humans or pagan gods which are themselves sort of idols which demons hide behind? So do you, in other words, do you think that there is like a real spiritual reality or real sort of spiritual force behind some of these pagan gods and pagan idols, and beyond just the human element?
Yeah, I do. And I wouldn't differentiate them. I think it's one and the same thing. So, Girard, and the way I was explaining it, Girard's audience and his writing were social scientists, okay, anthropology and so on. Right. And I really, love that approach because it kind of gets in there and just changes everything. The fact that, okay, so what is demons or spiritual entities and regular humans? These things are not necessarily totally separate. And neither are they to Girard, especially later Girard. So, okay, so we have the mechanism where an ordinary human, an arbitrary victim, is blamed for a crisis, killed, and deified. What drives people to do that, right? What drives people to accuse and to kill? So this is what I think Girard, or maybe me, calls the satanic mechanism, Satan casting out Satan. So the fact that a mere human gets killed doesn't mean that we're just not dealing with any spiritual forces. The spirit of Satan, the spirit of accuser, acting through history and ruling the world, this is what we're talking about, really, right? So this whole culture, human culture, is, Bible says that Satan is the prince of this world. That sounds like a harsh statement, and I think if it's interpreted in a cartoonish way, it is a harsh and ridiculous statement, because of course we're not all, our government is not ruled by Satan, right? And again, it's not necessarily that there's a satanic secret cabal ruling the world. What is meant by that, to Girard, is precisely this system where we as humans are psychologically entrapped in this satanic mechanism, okay, which is the mechanism of us not being able to face up to our own reality of our own sin. And we are very self-righteous. We all, we seek pride. We honor our ancestors. Pagan, rulers are always descended from some gods. So we're always the good guys. We care about our face, our honor, and we can never ever be the bad guys. We're proud. So the only way we can get along is through the satanic or sacrificial mechanism. So this whole system of religion based on innocent victims is satanic. So there are spiritual forces behind that too. And maybe we talk about psychedelics later. You know, when these people do these rituals and they do these trances, or even during a primordial sacrificial crisis, they see entities, they see common entities, they see a god or a demon or something. People testify to that. Is that real? Is that not real? Maybe it's real sometimes. So I'm open-minded to that. But it's not like you have these cases where it's just a bunch of guys like killing each other, but then there's like spirits. No, these things are the same. All right. And maybe depend how these things can get bad or worse. Like in a nice situation, you kind of you stop sacrificing humans, you kill a goat. You know what I mean? But if things really go into the kind of like extreme satanics, extreme, you get like mass human sacrifice and so on and so forth. So that's what it was. That is Satan casting out Satan. That is Satan being prince of the world. The whole time we're talking about that and the biblical and Christian revelation liberating liberating us from that. Okay. I forgot to mention, I just feel a need to mention Jesus' words on the cross, Christ's words on the cross, where he says, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." And I was just reading about that yesterday, where a lot of people might be just like, oh, Jesus is just being super nice. How nice he is. Even though he just got nailed to the cross, he's saying, just forgive them. I want to be a nice guy to the end. But to Girard, again, this is a lot of times, this is a very accurate, deep statement. Girard somewhere says that this is the first statement of the unconscious. Because you know how modern psychology is all about the unconscious, people doing stuff they don't really do. That didn't really exist before. Yeah. Pagans didn't understand subconscious, right? They thought everything's, there's no subconscious. But that's the first statement of subconscious, because Christ really says, these people that crucified me, they think they're doing the right thing. They think the God wants them to do that. But that's been debunked on the cross. So, again, that might be a topic for another day. And again, things can get bad and worse, because I think a lot of people, are pagan, I mentioned this before, are pagan gods demons? A lot of church fathers say that. But does that mean that every mother and child in like ancient Greece or something were demon worshippers? Well, now now we're talking modern stuff, right? It's not fair to say that all the Egyptians were worshiping the devil in the modern sense. Like if today you're worshiping the devil, even though you live in a modern time, post-Christian time, where you know that's bad, you're worshiping the devil, right? But a lot of these people, they just believed in violence sacred. They believe that gods are messed up. They're not to be messed with. They require blood. And in order for me to protect my family from the wrath of God, I got to offer this violent God substitute blood so he doesn't take my blood. But does that mean that some priests who were like officiating this religion didn't get like sucked in and kind of like started liking it? You know what I mean? And in that sense, were like pretty satanic? Probably. You can find some pretty like openly satanic, violent things in the human record, right? So things can slide down into like really bad stuff in the pagan world. But a lot of times people kind of have maybe partial revelations like Tao or the Greek philosophy, where people are just kind of starting to understand that, hey, this isn't, maybe gods aren't like this. Maybe this thing's messed up. Maybe it's just tragic. Let's not do that. And I read Tao many years ago. I remember being struck when I first traveled to Asia. I read Tao Te Ching, which is like a poem. I remember being struck, like, this sounds really Christian. There's a verse somewhere in there that says that a man with a sign will show up and everybody will convert to that sign. I'm like, is this the cross? I also wrote a little piece about...
Yeah, keep going. Keep going.
But you just threw me off. Yeah, I wrote a little piece about a while, or like a podcast episode about loving your enemies. And my argument, again, this is just me, okay? But my argument is Christ doesn't say have no enemies, right? And I think that's a big misunderstanding. Love your enemies, so it just means I'm friends with everybody. Well, he could have just said don't have enemies if that's what it meant. So I take a nuanced view. Loving your enemies means you're opposed to that person, you believe they're sinners, they're wrong, and you might have to battle them, but you have this human compassion for them. And I think that that's kind of strategically powerful thing, because I make a contrast with these like ignorant pagans who just hate their enemies, like you said. They can never understand their enemies, right? They just think our enemy is the devil, we're the good guys. They never think about their enemies. They never try to put themselves in the shoe of their enemy, right? And then I go back to actually Chinese classics, Sun Tzu, Art of War, who says, if you know yourself and you know your enemy, you will win 100 out of 100 battles. Then you go to the Bible, and the Bible, the verb know is used as same as the verb love. You're aware of that, right? Like he knew Rachel, right? It just means he loved Rachel. So it's like knowing somebody and loving somebody are kind of synonymous. If you know your enemy, you know how they think. It actually gives you the power to overcome them, and in a loving way. And I've seen this in real life. Think of like dumb fights. Think of dumb opponents, like some gangbangers or something. They're really ignorant. They don't try to put themselves in the shoes of their enemy. What's the result of that? Eternal tit for tat. You kill them, they kill you. Blood feud, right? It just gets retarded. We talked about this too with the Romans, right? The Romans appreciated barbarians, kind of celebrated them, and that's what enabled them to defeat them. Whereas barbarians are probably more pagan, and they were like, those Romans are demons, everything they do is wrong. So they never actually sat down to think like, hey, why are these Romans winning? Let's imitate them. You know what I mean? So,
Right.
All right. I
And
said
not
all
only
that to say.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. No, yeah. No,
A lot
and I
of
think you
stuff.
make a good point
Yeah.
because essentially like it right. And I think the thing here is if I can't in some sense empathize with my enemy, right, and see that he does not know what he's doing, then also I myself am more open to blind sort of self-destructive tendencies because if I've convinced myself that I'm just completely right, that's pride. Pride comes before the fall. I'm not able to learn from the, say, blindness of my own enemy because I'm not willing to sort of empathize with him. I'm leaving myself open to further destruction.
Yeah.
On the topic of pagan gods and idols, I had a view super early on that essentially these were just one-for-one representations of real spiritual entities. Like Zeus was a real, pagan god who was named Zeus, who had all the characteristics of Zeus, and was, that was true for essentially all of these pagan gods, and that they were all just demons in disguise, and they were seeking worship. My view now, and tell me if you think this is, if you think this might be a bit closer to reality. My view now is essentially just that a lot of these are obviously, in some sense, they are the result of these foundational myths, but also, as you were saying earlier, demons are involved in this process in that they sort of latch onto the passions and they involve the human will in sort of furthering whatever these ends are. And so, in a sense, Zeus as a concept might not be a real one-for-one entity, but it might be a sort of a mask or a sort of like a Trojan horse thing that demons use to get humanity to sort of latch on to or to emulate whatever their sort of twisted will is. Because like I said, like it's a change from my previous view that these are just one for one actual real real entities, and now I sort of more so think that they're sort of Trojan horse sort of things, or just perhaps like the demons will recognize a victim, or they'll recognize a human idol, and they'll sort of use it as a means to further their own ends. Because the Bible seems to say that these idols they have ears and they see not, they have eyes, they have eyes and they see not, they have ears and they hear not. This is a sense that these idols or these pagan gods are dead. They're not real. They're completely they're they're not living. But then also too, in the New Testament, it also says that the gods of the pagans are demons, or it might not be in the New Testament, but essentially the gods of the pagans are demons.
I mean, it says that all over the Bible, right? In
Yeah.
the Old Testament too, and the prophets, the devil, I mean, I think it could be both. I mean, that's like whatever demonology and so on. That's subjective experience. These things do get messed up. Who knows? I mean, I'm not determined one way or another. You know what I mean? Could be both. In some sense, we can say that these gods are projections of human egos and human desires, right? Later on, like desire for power, desire for beauty, desire for wealth, and all these things. That them being projections of human desire, in my mind at least, does not preclude the idea that there might also be some entities. How the spiritual world works, I don't know. Girard offers a very good scientific way to map it out, right? And Girard himself does not exclude the spiritual way, but kind of shows how they map onto each other. And again, things get nasty, more or less nasty. We don't know, like who knows what those guys are up to. Maybe some of them are just being egotistic, and they build their own kind of they hear not. They're kind of powerless to help you because they are projections of your own ego, and you can't help yourself. So I think there's a lot of theology in that, but there's just so many cases, and there's just so many messed up things, and also so many kind of exceptions to being messed up that I don't know. I can't make a blanket judgment on that. It's just really complicated. Long human history.
Have you heard of this show? My friend introduced me to it. I haven't watched it. I don't watch it. I really don't watch much TV at all. There's this show. Apparently, it's called American Gods, and it's this show where you have all of these different deities that are like all representative of these different aspects of American culture, and the show treats them in the universe of the show, they are real entities which do indeed gain power from being worshipped, and which a lot of representations of God, demons and stuff throughout literature and throughout a lot of fiction are sort of portrayed this way, as they're seeking worship because this gives them power. I think this is like sort of, I think in a way that almost gives a bit too much power to the concept of demons, because I don't think necessarily no amount of human worship is going to make no amount of human worship is going to turn a demon into anything close to God, right? So I think in a way there's almost like a pagan impulse within that whole sort of fiction. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that squares with Girard's theories, and we touched on it. It can all connect the dots. Like people have passions, people have kind of these bad, destructive passions, and I'm open to the idea that some demon out there, right, some spiritual force, can be summoned to help them succeed in that passion. And I'm also open to the idea that worshiping these passions is going to create multiplying effects that's going to give this passion power. But where these passions differ from the true God is that they might become powerful, but their power is always destructive, right? They destroy the person, they create idol worship, they lead to bloodshed. So they don't have constructive power. And that's really their goal. I mean, in theology, and in theology, the goal of demon is to destroy human life, right? So if you worship them to create this cult, they want that energy. They will harness it, but ultimately they'll harness it to destroy, to cause war. You know what I mean? Right. And that's what passions do. Greed and all that stuff. They're destructive. So they don't have constructive power, except maybe in those pre-Christian eras where there was some kind of a deal you could make, offer sacrificial blood, and they kind of leave you alone, and there was some civilizational aspect to it. So in short, again, I think all these things can be aligned to kind of agree with each other with the big theory, and they're not necessarily exclusive of each other. Passions, human passions, demons, pagan gods, so on and so forth.
Solid. Well, George, do you have any kind of closing statements for our pod today, or just the topic of pagan gods?
I think we covered it all. Yeah. I don't know. It was a good topic. He kind of went deep, but I just hope we gave a good picture to whoever's listening to us about this really Girardian anthropology, because a lot of people read up about this. I hope to bring in the Girardian angle, which a lot of people do not have, but I think it's at the very least it's very enriching, and it just sheds light on a lot of these texts, including the first one you mentioned, Augustine, right? And it just makes a lot of things click, when it comes to history.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, from my end, I think if you're somebody out there who might feel a little bit drawn in by the concept of like neo-pagan revivalism, we all know that this is kind of popular now. I would say just go and take what me and George have kind of put forth today and do your own research. One thing that I was very shocked by as I was introduced to Girard is that what he seems to put forth is super consistent, and it really rewards a sort of deep reading of not just the Christian tradition, but all of these other myths. And once you it's one of those things where once you see it, you really cannot unsee it. But anyways, guys, check out Boreas Substack. George is a great writer, and he talks about these topics a lot more in depth and with a lot more erudition than you might get from me on this podcast. So, George, thank you for coming on the pod once again, and I'm looking forward to the next episode.
Thanks for having me, Parks. Talk later.